For the Wild podcast is brought to you in part by the Calliopeia Foundation and listeners like you. Calliopeia supports projects interweaving spirituality, culture, and ecology. We are grateful for their support and the support of grassroots contributions from listeners. To learn more about the Calliopeia Foundation, visit calliopeia.org. To make a donation to For the Wild, visit forthewild.world/donate or support us through Patreon.
Welcome to For the Wild podcast. I'm Ayana Young. In today's episode, I'll be speaking with Marcia Bjornerud, a professor of geosciences and environmental studies at Lawrence University.
We naively think that we can rearrange landscapes and profoundly alter biogeochemical cycles, and that maybe we can anticipate what all the consequences can be, and that's absolutely not true. The Earth system is so complex. There's so many moving parts, many of which, perhaps most of which, we still don't understand. And the short and long-term consequences of all these rapid changes are beyond our scientific compass at this point.
Marcia's research focuses on the physics of earthquakes and mountain building, and she combines field-based studies of bedrock geology with quantitative models of rock mechanics. She has done research in high Arctic Norway and Canada, as well as mainland Norway, Scotland, New Zealand, and Lake Superior region. Marcia is also a fellow of the Geological Survey of America and has been a Fulbright Senior Scholar at the University of Oslo, Norway, and the University of Otago, New Zealand. She is the author of 2 books, Reading the Rocks, The Autobiography of the Earth, and Timefulness, How Thinking Like a Geologist Can Help Save the World, as well as contributing writer to The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Los Angeles Times, The Wall Street Journal, and Wired. Well, Marcia, before we begin, I just want to share that I've really been looking forward to this conversation. I think your work straddles such important intersections between geology, philosophy, and natural history. So thank you so much for joining us.
Well, it's my pleasure, Ayana.
Wonderful. Okay, so today we'll be touching on a lot of themes from your most recent book, Timefulness, How Thinking Like a Geologist Can Help Save the World. So to begin, I thought I'd read a short excerpt from your time researching in the Arctic. Quote, "Lost in my thoughts on the long walks back to camp each day, my mind washed clean by the sound of wind and waves, I have sometimes felt as if I stood at the center of a circle, equidistant from all stages of my life, past and future. The sensation spills over to the landscape and rocks, immersed in their stories. I see that the events of the past are still present and feel they could even be replayed again one day in a beautiful revelation." End quote. I love imagining this icy tundra landscape through your eyes, and I wonder if you could share what drew you to this field and introduce this idea of geological thinking.
Well, like many people, I knew very little about geology when I entered college. It's unfortunate that earth science is viewed by many people as a kind of lesser intellectual discipline than the other sciences, especially physics and chemistry and biology. So it was only when I took an introductory course, primarily to fulfill a general education requirement in lab science, that I discovered geology. And then it was as if I realized this was the thing that had been waiting for me all along. So I'm not alone in that kind of discovery of the field. For me, geology is like the etymology of the world. There's just such huge explanatory power in the lens of geology.
Mm-hmm. I love thinking back all the way to your school days and where that seed was watered. And now I'd like to explore the notion of deep time from a geological perspective, which, as you note, is sorely missing from Western culture, mainstream narratives, or our education system, and so forth. Now, in your writing, you often describe Earth's 4.5 billion year history as a dramatic story of development that is, contrary to popular belief, full of dynamic twists and turns. So could you acquaint us with the story of our shared geologic past particularly in regards to the shifting temporal speeds of Earth's processes, whether that be tectonic plate movement, the weathering of mountains, or the geochemistry of the oceans.
Geology as a discipline has been almost too successful in inculcating people with the idea that the Earth is so old and so slow, and that geological processes are incremental and almost imperceptible. And so what I've tried to do in my writing is convey the sense that we too live in geologic time. Yes, the Earth is very old, but it's still in process. It's a dynamic place that does have many tempos. Most of them, thank goodness, are slow from a human perspective, so there's plenty of time for us to adapt. But some of these tempos are startlingly quick. Earthquakes, for example, you in California know quite well, are much faster than we'd like. And so the Earth is not only a slow-moving entity, it's also very nimble. And certainly climate change is another example of a case where Earth changes, geologic processes, can happen on something very close to human timescales. And so that's the more complex, nuanced message that I'm trying to get through, that there are many moods that Earth has and many processes that operate over vastly different magnitudes of time.
Mm-hmm. I really loved your description of mountain building in Timefulness, how thinking like a geologist can help save the world. It was so beautiful to read, so I'd really recommend folks to pick up that book and dive in a bit deeper. Well, this brings me to the Anthropocene, the geologic epoch characterized by our human impact on Earth's climate and ecosystems. A piece in The Atlantic titled "How the Concept of Deep Time is Changing" notes that, quote, "A single mine in Canada's tar sands region moves 30 billion tons of sediment annually, double the quantity moved by all the world's rivers combined," end quote. And that, quote, "the weight of the fresh water we have redistributed has slowed the Earth's rotation," end quote. So in the roughly 10,000 year era of the human, could we say that geological time has started moving at the speed of human time? Or, in other words, how might we understand the unprecedented scale and pace of transformation we're seeing today in the context of the greater geological record?
Yeah, and so the idea of the Anthropocene is now in circulation, I think, quite widely in the public. Internally, in geology, there are some rather arcane arguments about exactly how to define it, but I think most geoscientists, including myself, think there is a compelling argument for saying we have crossed the threshold into some new regime in which human accelerated processes really do change the geologic rules so profoundly that we're probably in a new interval on the geologic timescale. It's certainly not something to be proud of. Some people have said, well, isn't this rather an arrogant, self-aggrandizing designation? But I say no, it's like a scarlet A for Anthropocene that we are wearing. It's not something to be proud of that we're altering the planet at rates that are nearly unprecedented in the geologic past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely do not see it as something to be proud of. And it's quite amazing just to witness the terraforming of this planet so quickly, especially with industrial techniques in the past few hundred years. It's shocking, really, to see how quickly we either are intentionally changing things like, you know, mining and just land shaping, but then also changing things like the Great Barrier Reef. And I feel like that's like an indirect way that we are shifting timescales and spaces.
Yes, and to me, those are the more terrifying things, that we naively think that we can rearrange landscapes and profoundly alter biogeochemical cycles, and that maybe we can anticipate what all the consequences can be, and that's absolutely not true. The Earth system is so complex. There's so many moving parts, many of which, perhaps most of which, we still don't understand. And the short and long-term consequences of all these rapid changes are beyond our scientific compass at this point.
I'm really happy in a strange way that you're saying that, because I too believe that we couldn't possibly understand the complexity of Earth's systems. And I wonder, with all of the predictions coming out of the scientific community around climate change, how much can we rely on those models and those hypotheses when we understand how little that we actually can understand about the complexity of these systems?
That's a profound and important question. I think most geoscientists, and in particular climate scientists, I'm not in that subdiscipline within geology, but certainly I pay attention to the professional conversations, are humbled by the complexity of the climate system and the ways in which powerful feedbacks, especially positive feedbacks, those that amplify small changes, have in the geologic past resulted in large magnitude, rapid climate change. So it's true that we don't know everything. And if anything, that incompleteness in our knowledge should make us want to use the precautionary principle, which is do as little harm to the stability of natural systems as possible, given the ample evidence that they can do very unpredictable things. So the system is complex. We have an increasingly nuanced understanding of climate. Many climate models have been tested and calibrated and recalibrated against each other and against the geologic and ice core record of past climate change. But no, we don't know everything. And I think humility, again, is the stance of most climate scientists at this point, that it is a complex beast, and changing it in even small ways can lead to really unfortunate consequences that we can't predict at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can really see that. And sometimes I feel like I've just strapped onto the roller coaster and I'm just gonna see what happens in so many ways. You know, I can try to understand and read as much as I can, but I agree that the unpredictability and uncertainty is so vast that preparing is challenging. But I think that the humility part is what we actually can prepare for in ourselves, and the doing of less harm. Those two things really make sense regardless of what the outcomes are. So thank you for speaking to that. Now, we know that we can no longer ignore the magnitude of our effect on the planet. And this brings me to the central tenet of your book, the importance of developing a consciousness of timefulness. Now, we need, as you write, quote, a clear-eyed view of our place in time, both the past that came long before us and the future that will elapse without us, end quote. So I'd love if you could elaborate on this notion of timefulness and how this might provide a path to re-entangle with our earthly history, reconnect with the ancient ones, and activate alternative futures.
Well, the word, which I think I made up, maybe others have used it before, but in my use of it, it's an intentional counterpoint to two things. First would be mindfulness, which is probably a good thing for individuals to practice, especially in these anxious times, of being present and thoughtful about the now. But I don't think mindfulness, if it means myopic focus on the now, is a good stance for a society. And that's, I think, in general, our society is far too focused on a very short time frame. The other thing that timefulness sort of rhymes with is, of course, timelessness, which we often hold up as an aspiration, that we should be outside time, beyond time. But that is ultimately impossible, and I would argue a kind of sterile idea. Everything evolves. Everything has had many forms and iterations in the past, and in that sense is timeful. All objects, people, cultures, languages, rocks, landscapes are full of the time that it has taken for them to take the form they're in now. And for me, as a geologist, there's a real joy in being able to look out across a landscape and read it, to understand its past, to have it speak to me in some way across millennia or even millions of years. And for that knowledge to somehow resonate with my young human brain. So I think this idea of timefulness is both essential for our society, which is so unable to look ahead even a few years and make plans, but also for us as individuals to make peace with our own mortality. And I think those two things are wrapped up in subtle and important ways. This moment when all of our lives have been put on pause because of the coronavirus is an interesting one, because I think it highlights some of the things that the book is about. Certainly our lack of preparedness, the fact that in only 2 weeks, our economy can basically collapse entirely, underscores our society's lack of a capacity for long-term thinking. There's really no reason in an affluent society like ours that we couldn't set aside some kind of buffers for ourselves in cases of events like this. We're really no better than a subsistence culture, maybe even worse, because we really are suddenly, our entire way of being has been disrupted in a profound way that could have consequences that linger far into the future. I also am interested, once we all come through this crisis, and it certainly is an important, or it's a serious public health crisis, but I'm curious to see what effect it does have on our anthropogenic footprint, especially carbon emissions. It'll be really fascinating to see how much reduction in CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions there are during this time. It'll give us some important benchmarks for how we might be able to take action in the future.
Yeah, in terms of the CO2 emissions, what I've been finding absolutely incredible is how quickly the skies have cleared. It's almost unimaginable to me that we actually are slowing down, because in so many ways I have prayed for us to slow down, but there were so many reasons why it could never happen. And now I'm saying it can happen, and people can adapt, and we can evolve quickly. We don't need what we thought we needed, especially those of us who are privileged in affluent countries. And to see the resiliency of just the sky itself, not even looking at other aspects of the ecosystems. It's so amazing. Yeah, it's just unbelievable to me. And I'm going to be super interested to see in the geologic time scale of what this lowering of CO2 emissions, what it will look like. And I really also hope and pray that when the coronavirus crisis does teeter off, that we don't go back to business as usual, and we don't just start to pollute and release as much carbon as we have been. I hope that we can see that through this time we actually can make huge changes. And I also agree with you in terms of how unprepared we are, and how especially this dominant culture's view of deep time or preparing into the future. I mean, there just is none. It's really about just the next quarter's bank account earnings. It's really not about forward thinking, and how that plays into mortality is also huge. Just thinking, yeah, we all are going to die. So how do we live now? How do we really show up in this time? Yeah, gosh, it really sends me into a vortex of thought. So thank you for bringing all of those pieces up. And
there's something deeply wrong with an economic system that's predicated on the idea that it can only be healthy if the fires are stoked to the maximum with resources at all times. So let's hope that some wisdom comes out of this time, that people, as anxious and isolated and afraid as they feel now, when it's over, will actually look back on this time and think, how wonderful that my kids could play out in the streets because there was so little traffic, and how wonderful that we could hear the birds singing again because of the cars not being around. And I'm optimistic that this will be a moment where we maybe become a little wiser and our priorities get realigned in a good way.
I'm with you there, Marcia, definitely with you. And you've written about how rocks offer a, quote, vivid record of vanished landscapes. And I wonder if you have any other practices or material portals you might offer to this community right now to bring these rich worlds and other temporalities to life?
Well, every place has a story, and increasingly it is easy to find those stories online or with groups like Sierra Club groups or hiking groups. But I do advocate learning to read landscapes and learning the quiet stories, even of places that don't seem to have much going on. There's a story that can be read. So I teach the introductory geology course every fall. We're in a part of Wisconsin that doesn't have a lot of topography. We're actually on the Niagaran Escarpment, which is one big step in the landscape, the same shelf of rock over which Niagara Falls falls way over in New York State. But other than that, people would think this is not a very geologically interesting part of the upper Midwest. So I have to overcome that kind of attitude among my students. And usually the very first week of class, even before we've really had much content presented, I take them out on a field trip to a rural area just outside town. And it's a pretty flat area, in fact, rather marshy. And we walk back on a dirt road. And then all of a sudden, they notice that there's a hill that's rising off to the north. And we walk around that and find that it's part of a gravel pit that's been excavated. And I have them walk up the steep gravel hill, which is pretty challenging because it's just loose pebbles and cobbles and sand, and ask them to make some observations as they go up. And they're kind of agitated. It's hard to go up because you take a step up and you slide a half step back. And then they get up to the top and realize that this is not just a mound, but it's actually an S-shaped hill that goes on for some distance back to the west. And that's intriguing. A couple of people start thinking, why is this hill shaped like an S? It kind of reminds me, they say, of a meandering river, but it's a hill. And so then I start trying to get them to listen to what this hill is telling them. And some people will have noted that as they walked up, there was actually layering. There were layers of cobbles and then sand and then pebbles and then sand and then cobbles again, but they're organized by size. And so I start asking them what possibly could have constructed this hill, and little by little tease out of them the idea that this hill was actually deposited by a river running underneath glacial ice. So the walls of the river are gone. They were ice. And all that's left is this sinuous, meandering pile of sand and gravel, neatly organized into size categories because the water velocity was fluctuating over and over. So it takes them a while to get there. There's students who have had no background in geology, but all of a sudden, this hill that they've measured with their feet is speaking to them, whispering in their ears, and they can imagine the tremendous volume and velocity of water that was rushing through this ice-walled tunnel. And they can imagine how much ice must have been above their heads if this hill is still something like 50 feet high. And so that's a very local example of this kind of insight, that it's not difficult to start thinking like a geologist, to start being able to read what landscapes are telling you. And it is utterly transformative. Usually on the way out on the bus, nobody's talking to each other, they're on their phones. On the way back, people are animated. It feels like we've had a collective epiphany. There's been something new revealed. And I'm a bit of a geo-evangelist because I feel that if more people had that sort of experience, we really would treat the planet and each other differently.
May this body be a bridge for the healing of this land. May the river flow through us, cleansing greed from our hands. May this body be a bridge from the water for the healing of this land. From the land. May the river teach us, oh great mother, cleansing greed from our hands. To this land.
Now, as you've spoken about in the past, I'm also interested in how a practice of timefulness might provide greater healing around our relationship with time. So I'd love if you could speak more on our culture's temporal illiteracy and how feeling into the deep well of time might feed us spiritually and psychically. How are we able to be more present in our humanity when we cultivate an appreciation for the more than human time beyond the dominant mode of capitalism, what you call the island of now?
Yeah, I think so many ills, ranging from environmental ones, which are the obvious, but to more subtle psychological ones, stem from our lack of a sense of deep rootedness. And I'm not a religious person myself, but certainly in the past, religion played that role. People felt a deep connection to their ancestors and the practices that they followed. And that's satisfied that real need for a sense of where one has come from and what will continue after one is gone. As people fall away from some of these traditional religious traditions, I do think that there can be comparable solace and reassurance and meaning in connecting with natural history and embracing rather than dismissing or ignoring our earthiness. We are earthlings, and we've emerged from this particular place. We are entirely shaped by the rest of the biosphere, by the solid earth that is the foundation for everything. And recognizing that, for me anyway, is some sort of spiritual comfort. And I think that science has not always been ready to maybe enter that realm. But I know for a fact that most of my colleagues in geology really do gain some kind of existential meaning from what they do. It's not just an academic pursuit or an intellectual game. It is some kind of more personal worldview. And I'm trying to share that with others.
Thank you for doing that. I love this excerpt from the last chapter of your book in which you write, quote, "We need spaces where, from an early age, children see that they are on an ancient, sacred path that stretches across time, that growing up and growing old are to be celebrated, not feared," end quote. So could you share more on the necessity of multi-generational institutions, practices, and spaces?
Yes, I think one artifact of our very technological age is increasing isolation of the generations, that we really define ourselves by the technologies we use, and inevitably people who are not as adept with those technologies become almost laughable, comic, or pathetic characters. And so understanding that we all go through different life changes is such an important part of being human, but the technological world around us makes that harder and harder. And sadly, the coronavirus has made this harder and harder as the generations are physically not supposed to be interacting with each other. So this is a temporary thing, but only exacerbates the problem. So I think this siloing of generations is a very dangerous thing. It feeds into other types of what I call chronophobia. It's fed by the capitalistic messaging that aging is bad, being old is bad. And so it's entangled with so many other ways that we try to deny our timeful nature. I'm an advocate of thinking of new kinds of cultural practices that would celebrate what is common across generations and that also help people embrace more their being native to Earth. I would love to see holidays that are, for example, celebrations of carbonate rocks that sequester CO2 out of the atmosphere for the long haul. We should have songs that we sing to children that celebrate biogeochemical cycles that keep everything on an even keel. So I'm trying to get some of my folk singing friends to come up with a new kind of songbook of time literate and earth literate melodies that maybe could unite us across generations and cultural chasms.
Oh, well, I'd love to hear that when that comes out. That sounds great. And now thinking about the lessons that geology has to share, I'd be curious to dig in deeper to what our planetary history can tell us about current day climate chaos. You've said that the Earth's history has seen moments of novelty and disruption, as well as long periods of durability and resilience. Given the harbingers of change we're seeing today, from biodiversity loss to the collapse of fisheries and growing dead zones in the ocean, how does this compare to past mass extinction events or other geologic periods when biogeochemical cycles have gone awry? What do these cautionary tales of the past tell us about the possibility of recovery?
Well, over the long term, there's certainly great cause for optimism. The biosphere on Earth has never completely been vanquished, even though there have been large magnitude instabilities and 5 great mass extinctions that we know of in the last 500 million years. So we've recovered each time. But the sobering news is that after some of these, the recovery has been very slow, like on the order of millions of years, which is clearly not the kind of time frame that most humans are comfortable contemplating. So Earth is resilient, life is resilient, but when things go badly wrong, they can stay bad for quite a long time. Now, trying to compare some of the great mass extinction events of the past with what we're in now, which many people, of course, are calling the 6th mass extinction, is a bit difficult because of the denominators. When we look at the geologic record, we often, if we're looking at things that happened hundreds of millions of years ago, the plus or minus values on our dating of the rocks can be on the order of tens of thousands of years. So we're not always able to tell the difference between something that might have happened on a, say, 50 million year timescale or 100,000 year, or sorry, 50,000 or 100,000 year timescale. And that's a big difference to humans. And when we look at what's happening today, we just have such a short window of time. The denominator is in years, and the numbers that we come up with when we're trying to calculate extinction rates for certain groups of organisms really depend on how many years are in that denominator, how many extinctions per year or per decade. So there's a lot of imprecision there. So rather like what we were saying about uncertainty with climate, I think humility and do as little harm as possible is the best stance, because the geologic record does show us that instability and damaging biogeochemical equilibrium can be something that takes a very long time to recover from. And typically, the victims in these mass extinction events were the largest and most specialized organisms of the time, the dinosaurs, for example, whereas much smaller creatures, and certainly microbial life, is always doing just fine through some of even the biggest upheavals. So those are sobering facts about past mass extinction events on Earth, and should give us pause before we disrupt some of these processes that are going on in the background that most people don't even think of. I think of them as the housekeeping crew that keeps everything neat and tidy. They're in the background. People don't even know that they're absolutely essential ecosystem services for all of us, and we disrupt them at our peril.
Absolutely. Just to go a little bit deeper into this, I'm wondering, how does the Earth find an active state of balance or equilibrium as we're talking about this recycling and recovery? How does the Earth find that? What does that look like?
That's a profound question. It is interesting that for the most part, Earth is at an equilibrium. There are times of abrupt change, and then a new equilibrium sets in. And it's mostly that biological processes, tectonic processes like volcanism, which exhales gases into the atmosphere, and then the processes of erosion and weathering are all about commensurate with each other in terms of tempo over the long term in geologic time. And that, to me, is a remarkable thing. You can imagine a planet, even one that didn't have life, where tectonic processes were maybe much faster than the processes of erosion and weathering. I guess Mars would be an example that it's really not active tectonically anymore, but there is absolutely no erosion going on there. And so we have these big ancient fossilized volcanoes that have been sitting there for more than 1 billion years, and nothing's happening to them because there's nothing to erode them away. Whereas on Earth, we don't have any landscapes that are that ancient. Earth is constantly remodeling its surface. And so the tectonic forces from the internal heat engine of the Earth are remarkably well balanced by the external forces of erosion that are driven by gravity and solar energy. There's no reason those have to be that commensurate with each other. That's remarkable. And then life has evolved to be more or less able to keep up with both of those sorts of forces. So we have this remarkable planet where very different kinds of processes are sort of tuned to each other. And in terms of the actual geochemistry of the Earth's ocean atmosphere system, that's largely mediated by microbes. They can reproduce so quickly, as we know with the coronavirus. They can constantly adapt to new conditions. If there's an opportunity to harvest some sort of resource from the environment, a microbe will figure out how to do that. And another microbe will figure out how to use the waste products of that first microbe. And so there's this just beautiful economy that is established and can, for as long as all other things remain the same, can maintain itself over the long haul. But then something happens, a meteorite strikes, or some part of the system is radically changed, and then there can be a ripple effect through the entire system till a new kind of equilibrium is achieved again. So this is one of the great questions about how the Earth works. Many of your listeners will probably have heard about the Gaia hypothesis that James Lovelock, an atmospheric chemist who's British and 100 years old this year, came up with in the 1980s. He posited that Earth was, in some sense, a superorganism that had the capacity, like a living being, to modulate its own internal body chemistry. This is an attractive idea. It's proven a little bit difficult to really test scientifically, but I think it's a useful conceptual framework for looking at the Earth, even if that's not literally true. The idea of planetary equilibrium, or what biologists call homeostasis, the capacity to keep your blood sugar, say, within a certain level, is a useful way of looking at the Earth over long periods of time. And so this is really a remarkable planet. And I feel frustrated with rhetoric about the idea of terraforming Mars and creating a new place for humans to occupy. I think that sort of thinking just reveals profound ignorance of the deep, complex, and ancient biogeochemical cycles that have kept this planet so hospitable for such a long time.
Sister, you are not too far for holding. I need your strength to carry on. Sister, you are not too far for holding. I need your strength to carry on. And our bodies are bound like the vines on the side of a house somewhere deep in the heart of the earth. Bodies are bound like the vines on the side of a house somewhere deep in the heart of the earth. Sister, you are not too far for holding. I need your strength to carry on. Sister, you are not too far for holding. I need your strength to carry on. And our roots intertwine like the redwood tree somewhere deep in the soil, in the soul of the earth.
This topic also raises questions for me around the billions of dollars poured into research and development of outer space. I think of initiatives like Elon Musk's SpaceX striving to create a spacefaring civilization and a multi-planet species, or Breakthrough Starshot, created by Stephen Hawking, Yuri Milner, and Mark Zuckerberg, who plan to invest more than $100 million in space exploration. In light of all the environmental and social crisis we face at this moment on Earth, what are your thoughts on space exploration and terraforming other planets like Mars?
Yeah. As a geoscientist, I'm fascinated by what we've learned about our neighboring planets in space, Mars and Venus and Mercury and the Moon, not a planet, but because it sheds light back on how remarkable the Earth is. And we can do a lot of that exploration by robots. In fact, they're a lot more reliable and a lot less expensive to send out into space. But as I said, the idea that we could somehow engineer another planet by fiat over a couple of generations or shorter timescale is so diluted. It just takes my breath away. I just don't understand how anyone could imagine that we could manage another planet that has a completely different evolutionary history than ours. It's hard for me to even start. The hubris of it is incredible. And it drives me a little crazy that every time there's a panic about there not being enough young children becoming interested in science, that we need to pour more money into space exploration is so wrongheaded. If people think space is warm and inviting, I can't imagine why they wouldn't be more interested in the deep histories of Earth. Many people say that thinking about geologic time is alienating. Well, space is alienating. Space is not warm and cozy. So I don't know, I'm sorry, I have just such a visceral negative reaction to these ideas. They capture people's imagination in a really dangerous way. I think they are just hubristic in the extreme. The same amount of money could be put into real solutions to our energy problems, finding truly carbon neutral energy sources. And it's just a very unfortunate things that some very wealthy people who have a lot of political power are deluding the public into the idea that these could even be possibilities.
I'm really with you. You said it much more articulately than I would say it, so thank you for speaking to that. I definitely have some strange thoughts around space exploration, especially at this time when we need support here on Earth. We really do.
And it's not mutually exclusive. We can continue to do space exploration. I really am fascinated by cosmic scale processes too, but we don't need to send people, and we certainly should not be spending huge amounts of resources creating colonies. The very word is rather abhorrent anyway, but it's just not going to be plausible that we are going to establish a second planetary base for humanity. We are Earthlings, and we emerged from this place. It's a beautiful planet. Let's learn to take better care of it. I just wish Elon Musk and others could take a really rigorous introductory year of geoscience and especially history of Earth. And I would hope that they might change their minds.
Yes. Oh, okay. I'm going to be sending some energy into that wish. Yeah. Well, I'd like to return to a note that we started around geological thinking, and in your book, The Invitation to Develop a More PolyTemporal Point of View. And you speak so beautifully about animating our geologic past, but I'm also interested in stretching our sense of temporal direction forward and folding the future into what Donna Haraway calls the thick present. This reminds me of the indigenous principle of 7-generation thinking and how we must, informed by these ethics, honor not only those who came before, but those yet to come. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on building our collective capacity for this kind of polytemporal thinking, or the potential of bringing this perspective into other spheres like governance or public policy?
Well, as I talk about in the book, I borrow one of Kurt Vonnegut's suggestions, which is to have a department in the executive branch that is the Department of the Future, have a Secretary of the Future whose job it is to always be reminding policymakers that we should be thinking of the coming generations. We really have nothing like this at present. The window of time for political decision-making in this country is at most 2 years. That's the congressional election cycle and biennial budget cycle. Anyone who is trying to think over longer timescales just doesn't get reelected because some of the decisions that would follow from thinking on those timescales are politically unpopular. So somehow we need to build infrastructural mechanisms into our political system, into our economy that reward long-term thinking and discourage this myopic now preoccupation, and at least having someone whose job expressly it was to think about the future is a start. And I do think, I'm obviously not very objective, but I think that having serious earth science in the schools is something that over the long term could start to make a difference. It's really shocking to me that even very educated people have almost no clue about how the earth works. And this is just an artifact of the development of geology relative to other sciences. Physics really was on the ascendancy in the 19th century and the early 20th century, chemistry, early 20th to middle 20th century, biology, middle to late 20th century. And geology is a late bloomer. We're in our golden age now, but the public perception of the earth sciences is really kind of Victorian. And it's a civic tragedy because we have a voting public who just doesn't understand the implications of their behaviors for the natural world and for their own well-being as residents of nature. So I have to think that a profound reorganization of our priorities in the educational system is part of it. Compensating people like teachers whose work is all about the future, compensating them better, revering them as important contributors to the civic good. So I guess I'm calling for a whole-scale cultural change, as well as policy changes that can be implemented on the shorter term while waiting for the culture to change. And certainly the one policy change that would alter things overnight is a carbon tax or some kind of price on carbon. Then behaviors would instantly change. The incentives would be so different, and we would see a completely transformed economy if we could just find the political will to do that.
Mm-hmm. It doesn't seem like it should be that hard, you know? It's like we can do all...
In some ways, yeah, it's so simple,
yeah.
And yet...
You know, we make other things happen just looking at this $2 trillion bailout. You know, things can happen quickly when the powers that think they are decide that that's what they want to do.
Yeah. So, I mean, this may be, again, as we said, it may be a template for change. It just making it feel equally urgent is the question. Can we do that?
Yes, I'm with you there. Now, I know earlier in our conversation, we were discussing this idea of not ever being able to understand the complexity of this earth, and not fully at least. And in preparation for this interview, I was interested in the way you spoke about the vast explanatory power of geology as a field, a kind of etymology of everything. And I think about the importance of the natural sciences as one of the lenses through which we can better understand the world and ourselves, kind of what you were talking about with having it in schools. But attention also arises for me in what I might describe as the scientific impulse to graft human logic onto everything, to know everything. And this is more of a personal philosophical question, but I wonder how you think about or hold the realm of the unknown, the vast sphere of the more than human earthly processes that we can't possibly see, sense, or experience.
Well, I think that for me, one of the attractions of geology is that awareness that one's knowledge is always incomplete. And I think I've made peace with that. I think early in my career, and maybe this is what turns some people off the field, is that fact that you can only go so far. The records of the past have been in part eroded away or buried and are irretrievable in some ways, and yet you can see part of it. And to me, that's fine. It creates a sense of mystery, and it motivates one to keep going and seek out any remaining clues that can be found. So that's something about geology that people have to make peace with, or they probably won't stay in it. And it comes back to that idea of humility too, that as one really immerses oneself in Earth's story and begins in some way to have a glimpse of what a billion years is and what can transpire in a billion years, there's a real awe that emerges from that I, again, think is an important counterpoint to our human narcissism, both individual preoccupation with our own mortality, but our collective obsession with all things human, that takes us out of our heads and reminds us of our deep roots in something much bigger. I like the quote that I use at the end of the book that is attributed to a Polish rabbi from the 17th century, Simcha Bunim. And it is that we should always carry two slips of paper, one in our left pocket that says, I am ashes and dust, and one in our right that says, the world was made for me. And I think geology somehow reminds us that both of those things are true. We are here now experiencing this glorious planet in its 4.5 billion year state, but we're not the first and we're not the last residents. And let's just make peace with that.
I love that. And yes, I'm so in support of getting out of our own little lives, and not just even our own lives, but our obsession with everything human. And it's just so narrow. It's so, it doesn't allow us.
It's narrow, and it's the cause of so much anxiety. If this is all there is, people have this sense that that's not enough. And so I think enlarging our sense of who we are can be a source of psychological and spiritual peace. I remember a quote from an anthropologist, I think Clifford Geertz. He defined culture something like this: the constellation of stories that a group of people tell about their place and purpose in the world. And in the West, especially now that many people have detached themselves from traditional religious practices, the stories we tell about ourselves are mainly about technology and capitalism. And the natural world is just a backdrop. It's just this passive scenery against which all the real action takes place. To me, that's a big part of our problem. The scenery is going to start directing the play very soon. And perceiving nature in that way also separates us profoundly from who we really are. So these stories that we tell about who we are, and that all that matters is the human created world, are so damaging psychologically and environmentally, and ultimately economically as well.
You said that so beautifully, and I really couldn't agree with you more on that these limiting stories that we tell ourselves and this obsession with everything human, it is detrimental to everything around us, the environment, ourselves. And I think you really hit on something too with the fulfillment and that anxiety of not feeling a sense of belonging or purpose. And that, to me, the sense of belonging and purpose comes from getting outside of the human-centered world and realizing that it is such a such a huge story, a much, much bigger story than I can even wrap my mind around. And that uncertainty, but the beauty in knowing that I, as just one human, is just a very small part in this play, and that the natural world is not a backdrop, but actually the star of the show. It allows me in that humility to actually find purpose and fulfillment and not feel the pressure that I have to somehow be everything, or humans have to be the thing that allows me to feel like there's a reason for me to be alive. You know, there's just so much that goes into that. And I think that the separation from our ancestral rituals that were in so many ways for most of us really relating back to the earth and the cycles of the earth, when we lose that connection and we try to find connection and purpose in technology or capitalism, we're always going to fall short. Like, I don't think we'll ever be able to find that deep sense of stillness and peace and that deep type of knowing in that regard. So thank you so much for speaking to that. That was really, really deep and beautiful. And as we come to a close, I'd like to circle back and read a short excerpt from the opening of your book. Quote, "For children who grow up in wintry climates, few experiences in life will ever elicit the same pure joy as a snow day. Unlike holidays whose pleasures can be diminished by weeks of anticipation, snow days are undiluted serendipities. Time was temporarily repealed, the oppressive schedules of the adult world magically suspended in a concession to the greater authority of nature." End quote. This memory reminds me of all the cracks or windows within our everyday experience for illumination.
And thanks for what you're doing. It's been fun to discover your podcast. So,
oh, awesome.
Bravo.
Well, thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to another episode of For the Wild podcast. I'm audio producer Andrew Storrs. The music you heard today was by Rupa and the April Fishes and T. Martin. I'd like to thank our host and founder, Ayana Young, as well as the rest of our podcast production team, Aidan McCrae, Carter Lou McElroy, Francesca Glassbell, Hannah Wilton, Aaron Wise, Erica Eckram, and Melanie Younger.